basically, the notion is each discipline and sub-discipline and so on uses literacy and in a different way than the other disciplines do. Let's be as simple as we can be. For the moment, mathematics, science, history, literature. And again, there's some people who throw another one or two in, or who would say, well, wait a minute, Tim, biology is really different than chemistry, so you got to, pay attention to some sub-disciplines. We don't have to get quite that fine-grained here. If we were talking about scientists at the moment, we would say scientists create knowledge, and they do it basically two ways. They either do it through experimental study or through some kind of systematic observation. That's where most scientific knowledge comes from. One or both or some combination of those things. They're going to create a knowledge that is meant to describe the natural world with some degree of accuracy. Let's contrast that with history. Now imagine you say you're a historian and you want to study what the Depression was like for Central Ohio, right? You going to do an experiment on that? Experiments won't really work for that kind of knowledge, will it? Well, what about systematic observation? We could go back to 1932 and watch. Well, no, we can't actually do this. So how do historians study? How do they create knowledge? And what they do is they try to come up with plausible descriptions and explanations of events by studying different, varied perceptions on them. Gee, this farmer's wife in the 1930s left a diary. Maybe we could learn something from that. Gee, the Columbus newspapers published a number of stories about the economic crisis. We should look at that. The point is, you would go looking for different kinds. Gee, the African American population. What information do we have on how they experienced the Depression? You would get all these different accounts and all these different points of view on it, and you have to pull those together. When you critique a text, critiquing a science text is very different than critiquing or evaluating the information in that history text, right? Because I need to know that you were weighing these perceptions right. What voices weren't you including? And all that kind of stuff. The science is a methodological thing. Did they set up their experiment right? What was the control group doing? Were the kids equal in the two? All that kind of stuff that we do. And it requires that they create different texts. Scientists tell us, we're trying to describe the actual world. We're trying to figure out how things work, but it's real stuff. It's out there. We're just trying to understand how it works. Is that what a mathematician does? Mathematicians essentially create imaginary worlds, abstract worlds. It's a different level. We always say, math and science, like they're the same thing. They're like on different planets. If you talk to mathematicians, they'll tell you the only reason Einstein got any place is because he knew more math than the other physicists. And when a mathematician will say that, and the other mathematicians will say, yeah, and he was an atrocious mathematician. They look down on those physicists because the physicists just don't have the level of abstract understanding that they do. Each of these fields is creating information in different ways. And what that means is that there are things about text that you're only going to learn from working with those different kinds of texts. There are things about how to read those and how to weigh the information. And if you're writing how to report the information, that's going to differ from across those fields. Now, elementary teachers have no responsibility for this whatsoever according to your state standards. So you could actually just say, well, given that, I'm out of here. We're going to go get a few drinks and we'll be fine. I'm glad you're staying. Because, in fact, secondary teachers are now, in most states, required to teach kids about this and to start to make this something that they're going to understand. And this isn't going to happen in an ELA class. This is going to happen, ELA teachers don't read the kinds of information that we're talking about. They don't have a lot of experience with the kinds of text. They don't think in the ways that these specialists in these fields are. If you look at science information, because they're trying to describe something real, they're trying to describe our natural world, and its processes, how it works. What they've found over these hundreds of years of doing science is that, in fact, language is too imperfect to accurately or fully describe what they're finding out. And so you read a science study, you read a science article, you're probably going to try to communicate 3 kinds of information. Yeah, you're going to use prose English. You'll use language like the rest of us do. But you're also going to probably try to represent the information graphically if you can. And then think of all the different kinds of illustrations and summaries of information, different ways that we express that content. And they do it mathematically. This is their highest level of it, trying to show you the numbers, trying to show you, here's a function, here's an equation that will summarize how this thing changes or whatever. And they're all important. In fact, they'll tell you they're all equally important. To actually read science intelligently, you read a few sentences and you look at the graphic and then you go and futz with the formula and then you look at the graphic again and you maybe reread those sentences. That's what it takes to actually understand the stuff. And you'll find, gee, there's insights about whatever that thing being described is that's in the graphic that's not in the language. Or there's something in the math that I wasn't seeing when I read the paragraph that's there as well. And so sometimes stuff even contradicts each other. You're not going to learn to do those with anything but science text and technical text. And you need to learn that from people who actually work with that kind of text and think in those ways. And even literature is a discipline, a way of thinking, a way of approaching our world. Literature, of course, focuses so heavily on language, so heavily on words themselves. And so, you see things like determine 2 or more themes of a text and analyze their development over the course of the text, including how they interact and build on one another. You don't find themes in science. You don't find themes in mathematics. You don't have themes in history unless they're saying we want to do a kind of a literature-oriented history, and so it isn't like real history, but it'll make those people who love stories like it better. And so the point is, we could spend a ton of time going through all of those standards. It's pretty clear that you want kids to be able to do all of those, and yet, in fact, our kids usually are learning to do one set of those. And it's usually whichever one they're good at. Whichever one was relatively easy for them. This kid got lucky and got a particular 6th grade teacher. This kid's mom was really terrific at fostering this particular idea. And he just reads a lot of that. He's gotten good at it on his own. And that's wonderful. We take great advantage of those kids. We take credit for him. I did such a good job with little Jimmy. He's going to become a scientist because of me. But the fact is, what we're not doing is what Ohio really needs. Can you take that kid who's really good with stories and make it possible for he or she to be an engineer who's going to maybe read stories for fun and help build your economy and maybe protect their family a little bit in some good ways? Or can we take that kid who's got such a mathematical talent and make them good at reading poetry? So maybe they can get some joy from that in their life. Can we do those kinds of things? Instead of sorting kids into, well, she's just a natural scientist, and so we won't stand in her way. But that means actually teaching kids to do these. What role does elementary school play in that? Well, the honest answer is we don't really know, but I've got 8 things to suggest to you. This is one that comes from a number of middle and high school teachers here in your state, maybe even from your counties and districts. Because what they're telling me is one of the big barriers for them teaching these disciplinary literacy standards at their grade levels is that there are too many boys and girls coming in who can't read at a 6th or a 7th or an 8th or a 9th grade level. That we're not bringing kids along far enough by the time we're sending them to middle school. I can tell you in Chicago, I got exactly the same thing out of our upper grade teachers as well. There are too many boys and girls who spend 5th grade being taught to read 3rd grade reading or 4th grade reading. And so then, if you're the 7th grade teacher and you have a really demanding science book, What you do in Ohio right now is you make the decision, I can tell them the information they need to know, and we can just not have a textbook. And that's terrific, as long as you don't mind when those kids go to college that they have to be in a remedial set of courses and will probably flunk out freshman year. Because in fact, that is what the majority of boys and girls in the United States are doing right now. We're pretending to prepare them, but we're not actually preparing them. So we need to talk about this a bit. But the fact is, in grades pre-K through 5, there are a lot of things that we need to do that would make kids better readers. And so, certainly one of those things that we know about with the little ones, preschool through grade 1, is there's a ton of research showing that teaching phonemic awareness, that is teaching kids to perceive the sounds. I'm not talking about phonics here. I'm talking about teaching kids to perceive the sounds within words, separate from meaning, to just be able to hear those separable sounds takes considerable work for many of our boys and girls, for most of our boys and girls. Some places that's happening, lots of places it isn't. What the research says is if we teach that, we can improve kids' ability to do that, and that improves both their decoding and eventually their comprehension. And so I would say that would be certainly one thing we should be doing. A second thing that we should be doing, and I can't even believe we need to talk about this, I've been in this field now more than 50 years, and we're still arguing over phonics instruction. When I came in, it didn't shock me at all because I was a newbie, but 50 years on, it does seem like we should finally decide that if the research says this is better for kids than not doing it, that it ought not to even be an issue of discussion, and yet it still is a lot of places. The research is pretty overwhelming that in grades pre-K through 2nd grade, explicitly teaching phonics, and I've been going through the studies, and I'm not all the way through them right now, but I'd say roughly a half an hour a day, because in all the studies I've reviewed so far, that was how much they were giving. So I'm not saying that more might not be better or that you couldn't get away with less, but the fact is, in all these places where they're raising kids' achievement by teaching phonics, it's coming out, it's not an average even at this stage. I've only found one study that was doing more than that. It's about 30 minutes a day is what I can tell you. But I haven't gone through all the studies yet, so I might change my mind on this. We should be giving kids substantial amounts of decoding instruction. Not just decoding instruction, of course, because if you're only teaching reading a half an hour a day, you're doing a bad job for us anyway. But we definitely should be teaching kids to decode words. Can some kids figure it out without our instruction? Yes. So why would we leave everybody else behind? Because somebody can figure it out on their own. Explicit teaching. That's true with phonological awareness, true with decoding. It's also true with oral reading fluently. Tim Rosinski fans. Teaching kids to read text accurately, with automaticity, with proper expression. Essentially, can you translate text into oral language? Can you make it sound like language? That's all we're talking about. And we find that we can actually teach kids to do that. We can give them the kinds of practice and support that allows kids to read text more fluency, and that improves reading comprehension. Teaching vocabulary. Teaching the meanings of words and the meaningful parts of words has been found to improve kids' reading comprehension. Large numbers of studies, grades 1 through 12. Bigger effects as you move up the grades. Just the opposite pattern that you see with fluency. Fluency is really terrific early on, and it gets less and less terrific as you move up the grades because more and more kids get fluent. Vocabulary, you never get to the point where everybody knows all the vocabulary. I'm still learning new words. And I'm old. So we do that. Comprehension, teaching kids how to think about text and how to learn from text, teaching them written language, not just vocabulary, but what do you do with sentences and cohesion and text structure and things like that. We can do some things directly with reading comprehension that help kids understand more. The fact is, we don't do enough of all of those things. And you'll see an individual teacher say, I really believe in that fluency thing, so we do a lot of fluency in my classroom. But I don't do phonics because I've never liked that. Or I do 5 minutes of it because I don't really know how to teach it. They didn't show me how. And I took the worksheets out of the program we have, and I did them with the kids, but I don't really know how to teach this. There's that kind of thing. Our kids need help in all of these areas. A second thing we can do is we can develop more extensive content knowledge. Even before they become readers, kids can start learning about their social and natural worlds. Disciplinary literacy depends heavily on disciplinary knowledge. And what Ohio middle school teachers tell me is kids come in knowing very little about science, very little about history, that that knowledge isn't there. Now, some of the time, that's the reading department's problem. People like Tim Shanahan. Because what happens in a lot of places, we know from surveys and various kinds of descriptive studies, that a lot of schools have decided the thing that really matters is our reading scores. We have to get really high reading achievement. And the way we're going to do that is if we teach less social studies and less science and less of the arts, we're going to be able to raise reading achievement. And what I'm here to tell you is that's a fool's errand. If you're lowering what kids are going to know about all of those things, you're going to cut down on the prior knowledge kids have to bring to reading comprehension. I was what was called the czar of reading in the Chicago public schools. I was responsible for more than 600 schools, more than 26,000 teachers, and 437,000 boys and girls. We had the shortest school day in the country of any major school district, and certainly lower than any of our northern Illinois school districts. I mandated 2 to 3 hours a day of reading and writing instruction, which is more than most schools do. But if you do the math, even in a place like Chicago, there's still, if we actually use the time for teaching, there's still plenty of time for teaching social studies and science and the arts and mathematics and all of it. In fact, I've got a piece in this month's educational leadership where I take the average elementary school day in the United States, according to the federal government, 6.5 hours. Do the math. Let's start with 2 hours of ELA and an hour of math and see where you get. And I think you're going to find we have plenty of time to teach social studies and science and things like that if we're dedicated to it, if we're serious about it. Some teachers don't value knowing information. As a teacher said to me, you don't need knowledge anymore now that you have Google. It doesn't do me any good to have all that knowledge in Google. To do my work, I hope the surgeon that operates on you has all their knowledge in Google. Good luck to you. It doesn't make any sense. Even getting the information out of Google means quite often that you know something about the body of information you're trying to search and how it's structured and things like that. How many of you have, your district uses maybe a textbook program for teaching reading? Anybody? A few of you? Okay. If you look at those kinds of programs and other programs that are similar to them, typically what they will do, part of the package, is they'll have some kind of assessment so that you can monitor kids' progress. Now people know where I'm coming from. And they might be weekly tests. Quite often they're unit tests, right? I've never been a huge fan of all that, but I know districts, they won't buy it unless it has that. So, it's important stuff. And what's on those tests? Well, the vocabulary that we taught is on those tests. The skills that we had the kids practicing are on those tests. If there's a little bit of grammar that we were teaching, maybe there's some of that on the test. What isn't on the test? What isn't on the test is any of the content that we had the boys and girls reading about for that previous 6 weeks. Because we don't care whether they come away with that information or knowledge. One of the best opportunities in the day to increase kids' knowledge of the world is when we're guiding them to read a text. Okay, a third point. Expose kids to disciplinary texts. Students should have access to disciplinary texts in science and history, math, certainly literature. An informational text should vary in terms of the text types and modalities and topics and purposes and all that. Kids should have a very rich exposure to these different kinds of texts. Certainly one of the ways of doing that is including informational text right in the reading instruction itself. We're doing a better job on that than we used to. I mean, when I was an elementary teacher, it was almost 100% all the stuff that we had. I was a primary grade teacher. it was all stories. You know, the kids didn't read history or social studies or any of that kind of stuff. They read stories. Now that's changed a bit, and some of that change is real and some of that change is fake. So for example, a program might tell you that they're giving 50-50 in terms of the attention to literature and informational text, which is great. That's what the state is asking you to do, 50-50. But I'm not sure a 2-page informational text balances out against a 25-page story. Gee, we've got 2 texts here. One we're going to spend 15 minutes on, one we're going to spend 3 days on. That's not necessarily balanced in that way. So we should think about that. I think we're actually doing a better job of that on the textbook side right now than is true in all the little book rooms and stuff. Because there we're going on individual teachers' taste. And I have teachers tell me, oh, my kids just like stories, so I only pick stories for that. Usually it means the teacher really likes stories and so wants to work with stuff that she enjoys. But that's not really what we should be trying to do. We should be focusing on expanding these kids' experience. Include informational texts in classroom libraries. If you visit school libraries, those librarians do a pretty darn good job of making sure that there's a rich coverage of all kinds of information. That's not necessarily true at the classroom level when you look at the libraries that teachers assemble. Now, some of that might just be what's available to them, but it's something we ought to be paying attention to so that kids can read about dinosaurs and not just fantasies. This third point, don't be afraid of informational text for read-alouds. Now, I'm going to tell a story. It's an old story because I'm an old man. My youngest daughter, who's a grown-up lady now with her own little girls, but when Megan was a little girl, I used to read the finest literature you could imagine. All the great books. When she was about 8, one day, we finished a book, and I said, what are we going to read next? And she said, why do you always get to pick? Yeah, right. What's that about? You know, I said, why? Is there something you want us to read that, I'm not picking? She said, could I pick? I said, yeah, you could. What do you have in mind? Not really sure that she had anything in mind, to tell you the truth. I think she just wanted a little power. She looked at the bookcase, my bookcase, and she said, would you read that one? What she picked out was In the Shadow of Man, Jane Goodall's account of her anthropological work in Africa. Yeah, not exactly written for 8-year-olds. I said, do you really want to read that? She said, yeah, would you? I read that to her. Now, Megan, and I can't say it's because I read that to her and those kinds of books to her, but I can tell you she's my science kid. Now that she's a grown-up lady, she's an engineer, she designs medical equipment. Many districts don't provide text for the various subjects. Social studies, we don't want to spend money on a program in elementary social studies. Teachers can go online and find whatever they need. Well, maybe they can, but they don't. That's just absolutely foolish. Or we do hands-on science, so we don't need a science textbook. Go talk to scientists about that decision, and they will tell you that's a really bad idea. Ask those boys and girls who thought they were going to go into science when they hit Physics 101 freshman year and find out that you have to read a textbook, and they haven't seen a textbook in 4 years. See what happens. It's not working so well for those kids. Oh, here's a big one. So many teachers are scared to death of having the kids actually read things like a science book or a social studies book because those books are hard and they're written usually at grade level. And we all know in reading that if you're going to teach kids to read, you have to teach them at their instructional level. But that's not actually what the research says. That's just a belief system that we've imposed upon ourselves, and we're using it, frankly, to block kids from knowing about things. In a leveled reader classroom or a textbook classroom that has all the little leveled books, what you do is you go through and you find stuff the kids can already read pretty well, and you assign them that to work on instead of confronting things that they can't already read well so that they could learn how to handle it. And of course, science books and social studies books and math books don't have those kinds of accommodations built in. This idea of teaching kids at their instructional level essentially, they came up with the idea. A fellow by the name of Emmett Betts came up with the idea. And he claimed it was research-based. He claimed that if you taught this way, kids would make faster reading achievement. Essentially, what he concluded was that you had to place kids in books that they could read with 95 to 98% accuracy. So if you had a kid read a 100-word passage, they wouldn't make any more than 5 oral reading mistakes. And if you asked them questions about that text, they'd be able to answer 75 to 89% or 75 to 90% of the questions. You know where that came from? It's a really interesting story. It's something I got to tell you, as a classroom teacher, I tested my boys and girls every year with an informal reading inventory, and I always had multiple groups going with all the different levels of books, which wasn't easy in those days because we didn't have all the little books. You had to put together like multiple basal reader sets and combine them in odd ways and so on to make it work. Betts wrote about this in the 1940s, and he based it supposedly on a study done by one of his students during World War II. This Kilgallen study that I have listed here. He said that what they had found was that if you placed kids in text at their instructional level, and those numbers that I gave you came out of this study, that kids would learn, that'd be their optimum placement, they'd learn more and blah, blah, blah. When I went back as a young professor and found this study, I was stunned to find that they hadn't placed anybody in any kinds of books. They hadn't tried to teach anybody anything. They hadn't, yeah, I know, some people are looking, oh, that couldn't be true. Essentially what the study was this. They took a small group of 4th graders, and they had the kids do reading and answer questions and that kind of thing. So they essentially gave them informal reading inventories. And what they were looking for is trying to find how many oral reading errors the kids could make and still get that 75 to 89% comprehension. That was what the study was. It's essentially, gee, when the kids only made 5 mistakes, they could still answer that many questions. When they made more of those mistakes. When they were interviewed about it later, where did the 75 to 89% come for in comprehension? They couldn't remember, but they assumed it was something they just made up. And we told people that you had to do this or kids weren't going to learn. This fellow Powell, he bought this notion. He thought there was an instructional level, a particular way to match kids to text that was going to facilitate their learning. So we might have to protect kids from a science book, that kind of thing. And he even believed that Betts did it the right way by looking at these relationships, but he thought they screwed it up. So what he did is he went and did the same kind of study with 1st through 8th graders, much larger sample, and he found 2 things. He found one, at different grade levels, apparently kids could tolerate more or less disfluency and still comprehend. So, maybe 4th graders could make a lot of mistakes and still understand it, but 5th graders couldn't, that kind of thing. So he was arguing that there wasn't one instructional level, there were a bunch of them. And 2, it was pretty clear kids could make a lot of mistakes and still get this level of comprehension, which of course would say we should be putting kids in harder books, that's the real instructional level. Powell is widely cited, but he's always cited as a kook because he got the numbers wrong. And we know he got the numbers wrong because the smaller study with a narrower group of kids had a different number. Colin Dunkeld was one of his students. He did a really interesting study. He went out to 2nd grades, found what books the teachers were placing kids in, tested the kids' ability to read those books to see, how fluent and how well they could comprehend it, and then tracked the kids' learning across the school year to see what he wanted to see is which placements were leading to the greatest amount of learning for those kids, who made the most progress. What he found is the kids who made the most progress, who learned the most about reading in 2nd grade, started out with their fluency was about 85%, which is substantially lower than we tell you it should be. And their reading comprehension was down below 50%. In other words, they couldn't already read the books, but over the year they learned to read those books. Kind of interesting. That study's never cited. Jorgensen did a very similar study with 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders and found that placing those kids in the different levels, having kids at instructional level, it wasn't making any difference at all in their learning. Morgan, in the year 2000, we get 54 years after we start telling teachers you have to do this because it's going to help kids learn, somebody decides, why don't we try it and see if it works? 54 years. It's a little gap. Does a randomized control trial. tests a bunch of second graders with the DRA, figures out their reading levels according to the standards that I gave you, the criterion that I gave you, randomly assigns kids to one of three groups. So the kids against this wall, the middle kids, the kids over on this wall. You guys over there on that wall, we're going to teach you at your instructional level. So if you test out at a second grade level, young man, I'm going to put you in a second grade book. Okay? You guys here in the middle, you're just like them. Remember random assignment? If you read like he does, I'm going to put you 2 grade levels above that. I'm going to put you in a 4th grade book. Kids on this wall, I'm going to put you 4 grade levels above your reading level. And we know how that's supposed to come out. These guys are going to burn the school down. Right? It's going to be terrible. It'll be like reading hieroglyphics. Those kids are going to act out terribly. They do this for a school year. Come back at the end, they test everybody. You'll be pleased to know all the groups make some gains during the year. These guys who are so perfectly placed at their instructional level made the smallest learning gains of anybody. Learned less. You guys outperformed them almost 3/4 of the school year in reading ability. You learned everything they did plus like 3/4 of the school. And you guys who I said were going to be such a disaster. You didn't do as well as that middle group. You sure outperformed those guys over there. This group was almost exactly halfway in between the 2 groups. Outperformed the instructional level kids, but certainly didn't do quite as well as this group. Brown did a replication of this a couple of years ago with 3rd graders, found the same thing. O'Connor did this kind of thing with children with IEPs. She was looking at learning disabled children. What she found was that you could teach these kids with IEPs. These were 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. The best reading of them were reading at a beginning 2nd grade level. And what she found is that, frankly, if you took a 5th grader and you taught him at his reading level, he didn't do any better than if you taught him at his grade level. I shared that with a group of boys and girls, special ed boys and girls here in Ohio, high school kids. When I shared that study, they cheered. I asked them why. They said, because it means we shouldn't have to work in the stupid books anymore. They can't see why any teacher would put them in a book that's different than what their peers are reading. It's going to cut them off socially. That's going to cut them off from the content that they're capable of handling in terms of their maturity and intellectually, if it's not going to help their reading in any way. And these studies are saying it's not helping their reading. And Kuhn did a study comparing an approach to reading where they teach kids at grade level, 2nd graders, and then 3rd graders at grade level versus guided reading, and it blew it away. And Homan tried to, with 6th graders, put in some at instructional level and some a year above whatever their instructional level was, and it wasn't making any difference. It wasn't giving them any benefit. There's a new study that just came out in Reading Research Quarterly in the last couple months with high school kids finding exactly the same thing, that in fact, except for the very, very, very lowest readers, like beginning, like new coming second language kids, frankly, the kids did just as well with the content if they were allowed to read the grade level texts. We're using this kind of ideology, these beliefs, despite the empirical evidence on them, and we're blocking kids in a lot of cases from reading the science book or the social studies book. 4, it's not enough to make books available. You've actually got to guide kids to read disciplinary text. Just throwing kids in hard text isn't a solution. You got to require that kids read disciplinary text and hold them accountable for making sense of these. That means actually showing them how to do it. If you visit a lot of classrooms, you're going to see probably the most typical reading-centered social studies lesson looks something like this. The teacher will call on this young lady to read the first paragraph to everybody. Get your popcorn, essentially calls on the kids she knows can read it. You read the paragraph, and then I will stand here and tell you what that said. I'll tell you what that meant. And now I'd like you to read the next paragraph. You're one of my good readers. And now I'll tell you, everybody, what that paragraph meant. And we'll go through the text like that till the half hour's done. And see, I'm using the textbook. But you're not teaching anybody to read that textbook. You're not enabling anybody to do anything with it. You are maybe getting the content knowledge out, the information. That's not a bad thing. But you're not teaching kids to do any of this independently. You're making them weak, not strong. Informational texts at these levels tend to describe, compare, or sequence, or make causal connections or problem solution connections. Set purposes for kids reading that are in line with what the text is going to provide. Boys and girls, we're about to read. In fact, I've got language for you if you need it. Read the next page to find out about the similarities and differences between. Read to find out about what causes. Read to find out how the text describes. Read to find out what solutions there are. Read to find out the order in which these things, right? I'm not telling the kids what it says, but I'm guiding them to pay attention to the purpose of that text and what kind of information is there. Review the words that you think the kids aren't going to know that they need to know to make sense of the text. Essentially what I'm saying is do some kind of guided reading with content text. Even in elementary school, that makes sense. And so, what do? We set purposes. We make sure that if there are words that we think are going to trip you up, we're going to do something about it. I'll probably only have you read certain sections of it so that we don't, the longer the text is that you have to read, the harder that's going to be for you. So if I start with short sections and question you on those, and then over time, of course, I want to spread that out. Maybe young kids, I might start with a sentence. Can they read one sentence silently from the social studies book and answer my questions on it? Well, they couldn't. So we're going to have them read it again, and I'm going to ask more questions on it. Intensively question. Hey, they can read a sentence in social studies silently and answer my questions. Why don't we try 2 sentences? And then 4. And how about a paragraph? They could, they can't read 2 paragraphs. We stretch them out. We teach them to do these things is my point. And of course, the accountability. How do you follow up? And the simplest is a discussion. I ask them questions. We talk about it. So you can have them write about it. Well, again, we'll talk a little bit about that. We could do some kind of a graphic response. Maybe fill out some kind of a graphic organizer. It's not enough that they read the text. They've got to be able to demonstrate that they can use the information from it, whatever that is. We teach reading comprehension in the morning, and we don't use guided reading when we teach science in the afternoon. And I'm trying to understand what's the difference. And the difference usually is the kids can already read the reading text because we placed them at their instructional level, so they don't really need all of our guidance. When kids are going to struggle, they need a lot of help. When it's going to be easy, we want less help. Just the opposite of what we do in all kinds of ways in our schools. Boy, in some fields are so vocabulary-centric. Science is a field, if you look at a typical elementary or secondary or even college-level science text, what you'll often find is page after page of the introduction of new concepts and words for those concepts. And so there might be 10, 20, 30 new definitions in each chapter. And in some high school ones, even more than that, believe it or not. If you look at what the publishers tell you to do with that material, is they know the kids aren't going to know the scientific terms already. They're going to tell you to teach those to the kids before they read the text. And then the text, you know what they do? They define those terms and explain them. Why would you teach somebody the concepts before you had them read what the concepts were? Why would you do it for them and not have the kids doing any of that themselves? And so the example I've been using is you have a text, and let's say this is a 4th grade text, and it's going to explain photosynthesis. It's going to define it. It's going to tell you that that's how plants feed themselves, that they translate light into nutrition and that kind of thing. I'm going to suggest that if the author is going to define a term in the text, we never tell the kids that definition ahead of time, that become a comprehension question. So at the end of this reading, I'm going to say, boys and girls, what's photosynthesis? To see if they were able to make sense of that part of the text. Could they get the scientific definition? If they couldn't, we're going to go back and look at it. I'm not going to just tell them. We're going to go back and see if we can figure it out from the text. So one rule, if the text is going to define a term, we're not going to tell the kids the meaning of that term. We're going to have them try to make sense of it. A second rule I would come up with is if I thought boys and girls could figure out the meaning of a word either morphologically. I had a teacher in here this morning telling me that her school, their science department does a really good job of teaching morphology, and they spend a lot of time, and the kids know all these word parts. But then when they introduce the new words, they teach the kids all those words. They don't have them actually apply them to try to figure them out in text, which doesn't make any sense to some of us. What we want kids to do is to learn how to make sense of the vocabulary from the context when it's possible. And so I'm going to say, if there's a word that you don't think is defined, but frankly you think the kids could figure out from the text, don't pre-teach it. Make it a comprehension question. You know, a text I've been working with, it says something like, the glaciers melt, and when they do, they raise sea levels. Doesn't define what a glacier is. A lot of teachers say, oh, my kids won't know what a glacier is. Okay, but a lot of teachers say, I think they could figure it out from that sentence. Cool. Let's not tell them what glacier is, but at the end of the reading, I'm going to want to know, can you tell me what a glacier is? If you can, we'll keep sailing. If you can't, we've got to go back and read that sentence. And what do we do to figure that out? Every reading program on the market typically has 3 or 4 lessons a year about using the context to figure out word meanings. No problem with that. But why isn't that part of every single shared reading or guided reading, or, you know, we're going to read a text together? Why aren't we always doing that? Asking about those words, not telling them ahead of time. Work with multiple texts. Now, this is something that differs by subject, so let's talk about this one just a little. Some subjects, and what I'm thinking of most is social studies, perhaps literature. Some subjects depend upon the reading of multiple texts. We did a study where we were studying historians, and when we asked them about textbooks, they were not anti-textbook, don't misunderstand. They weren't saying you shouldn't use textbooks, but they were saying it's impossible to teach history from a single textbook because you're not teaching history, you're teaching something else. I talked to you earlier about the nature of history and that it's these plausible stories based upon all these multiple accounts that you have to pull together and figure out the perspectives of. If you give kids accounts, only singular accounts, and don't show them the variation in the take on it, you're not showing them history, you're showing them something else. And so what they said is, you know, if you have multiple textbooks going on in the classroom, that would be okay. If you had a textbook and maybe text sets of primary documents, that would be okay. But you can't teach history with a single text. And that's certainly true by the time you get to the kind of history you're learning in middle school and high school, and that's perfectly reasonable. But the fact is, we introduce history to 4th and 5th graders, and it would be possible for us to have kids read multiple accounts, as you'll see. And there's no reason not to. Now, science is a different game. The multiplicity of science I've already talked about. It doesn't come from multiple texts, it comes from multiple parts of the same text. You know, what do you get in from this graphic? What do you get in from this paragraph? What does this number tell you? Right? It's that kind of thing. It's not, oh gosh, can we have kids read 9 different texts and see which version is best? Scientists don't spend much time on that kind of thing. History knowledge is not factual, but plausible. Historians develop their plausible interpretations based on their analysis of evidence drawn from multiple perspectives. I don't know if I've got one example here for you. I don't know if you've come across this historical scene investigation, HSI. You know what I'm talking about? Do you know CSI? And so do the kids, of course. HSI is the same kind of thing, and these units have been built by various professors and teachers, groups of educators, history educators. And they're aimed at usually middle school and high school, but I've used at least one of these with upper elementary kids, and I know it's workable. But essentially, the one I used was on the Boston Massacre. And so 5th graders often study the American Revolution in U.S. schools, so couldn't you pull that in for 5th grade? Well, what does it have in it? And I don't remember the number, but let's say it's like 12 different accounts of what happened. So there might be, here's part of the court testimony, you know, for the trial that took place after the massacre occurred. Here's a painting that was done 50 years later showing, you know, what the British had done and how terrible they were. Here's an account from one of the lawyers. All these different pieces that had been written at different points in time by different people. And the kids have to, you know, they get this file of evidence and they have to go through the file and try to figure out what actually happened because they've got all these competing accounts. And they have both US history and world history. It's kind of interesting. It's just an example though. There are times where we might want kids to synthesize scientific information from multiple texts. And so I'll get some ways in that you might have kids reading texts where they're collecting information on particular scientific information and might want to organize it in some way so they can make sense of it. Got some ideas there. But the idea, especially in literature and in history, having kids not read single text but multiple texts really is sensible. 7, teach disciplinary writing too. And this is one that, we put so much emphasis on the reading part of this, but in fact, when you have to write some things, it often forces you to think more deeply about it in various ways. Steve Graham and his colleagues have shown that when you have kids writing about the text that they read, and often this writing takes place in social studies or science or math, having them write about those texts, not just writing about what they did on the playground yesterday, that kind of thing, actually raises their reading comprehension and improves their knowledge of whatever it was that they were reading about. They come away with more of the information. If you look, there are really only about 4 ways you can write about text, I think. One of those is to try to make a text like the one that you were reading. Another one is to summarize it. Summarizing has a real powerful impact in those elementary school years. Another one is to analyze the information and critique it somehow. And the final one is you actually read multiple texts or multiple pieces of information and you pull those together. And so, for example, good writers become good writers because they imitate what they write. They imitate structure and style and language, which means you have to read the text often repeatedly. I have an example. This gives some guidance on how to do the select strong text examples, read and reread them, decide which features need to be captured, and so on. I have an example, and this is obviously a little kid example. And this is a literary example. This is trying to write a story, which is a different kind of a structure than you see in most of these other kinds of texts. And this is a 5-year-old. Once there was Erin, and she went to Amy's, but she met a wolf, and he got to Amy's before I did. And see, it starts out third person. But when you're 5, trying to stay in third person very long isn't going to work. Now, I'm obviously showing you a very simple beginning level kind of a writing model. People are doing exactly the same thing with argument structures in middle school and high school, and every other kind of description and so on. And so the trick is strong structure in the text itself that you're going to work with, that you're trying to, and then you have to read it and reread it and figure out what you have to replicate, but it gives you an idea. Summarizing, of course, is effective because it encourages kids to think very specifically about what the author wrote. When we look, and I have the data in here for you to see how big a payoff you get from summarization, where it's a bigger impact, is it bigger with young kids or older kids? And what you'll see in all of that, frankly, is that big, powerful learning payoff for elementary kids from writing summaries, both in terms of the content that they learn, in terms of how much it improves their reading. And that payoff gets much smaller when they're in middle school and high school. And I think the reason is when you're in middle school and high school, you don't have that much trouble figuring out exactly what the author wrote. You've got to go deeper than that. And so doing more extensive kinds of writing, like the critiques and analyses and things that I was talking about, start to have a bigger payoff. Now, that doesn't mean little kids shouldn't do analysis and critique or that they shouldn't do synthesis. But think proportionally. If there's a big payoff from one thing and a small payoff from something else, which one would you spend more time on? Right? And then over time, it wouldn't be, oh yeah, and summaries go away for those older kids. No, summaries become less frequent and they get replaced by more of these things that have a bigger payoff for them. Is that making sense to folks? One last idea. And this is one that, in a way, runs counter to a little bit of what I've said to you. There is absolutely no question that we should be teaching older kids disciplinary literacy to an extent that we're not doing right now. And it's also true that if if you look at a second grade science book and a second grade social studies book, they don't differ very much. They differ in content. Their style isn't very different. They don't define things very differently. They don't organize the information differently. They don't really use different kinds of graphics. By the time kids are in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, it's like these folks are from different planets. The texts are so different. And that change doesn't happen all at once. It happens over time. And so it is quite possible in 4th grade or 5th grade, or that example I had of Erin when she was a little girl, there are particular things that you can teach from a particular discipline because it fits the texts you're working with. And so I have an example of that. And what I'm essentially saying is, why not teach some of those things that the kids have to master by the time they're in middle school or high school? That's certainly not going to hurt them to get a head start on that. The example I've brought you of this, I was invited to work with a school district, a suburban school district in the Chicago area. And they wanted me to come in and teach 5th grade American history. Now, I love American history, so I thought this is going to be cool. I've never gotten to do this. I like that kind of stuff. I like reading that kind of stuff. And I was supposed to do something with disciplinary literacy. Well, the night before I was supposed to teach this lesson to 2 classrooms of 5th graders, all in one room. They faxed me the chapter, and I couldn't understand it. It was just so amorphous. This isn't hyperbole. How do you teach a lesson if you can't understand the text? Especially if you get like 15 teachers watching you teach the lesson. I'm going to look like an idiot. Now, I could have done the old content area kind of reading thing or reading strategy kind of thing. Boys and girls, good readers ask questions. And so what we're going to do today, we're going to ask questions. That's right. I want you guys to read the first page, and then you ask questions, and I'll make sure you get answers to your questions. Cool, huh? Hey, that actually helps. But it's not what I was really there to do. What am I going to do with this? Well, what I did with it, and this was not meant for research, though what I'm going to show you has actually been researched quite a bit, and it's quite effective, it turns out. One of the things that we know from the research on textbooks and teaching kids to read history and so on is the texts are often really incoherent, that they leave a lot of information out. And there are studies where people have gone, what if you put that information in? What happens to kids' comprehension? And their comprehension goes way up, they understand it more. But the fact is, readers often come up with texts that aren't perfect. And so I kind of came at it from the other end. Instead of, how could I recompose this text so that I would understand it and could explain it to somebody? How would I get the kids to actually deal with this text in a way that would allow them to understand it like a historian would? To look at it not as a story, but as a theory about history. How's that? Turn it into an argument instead of a set of stories. So this is the chapter. And all I've done here, this is a 25-page chapter. I've taken away all the graphics because they're usually in social studies texts for kids tend to just be illustrations. They're there to make the pages pretty, not to inform you. So I took that all away, and there was a quote under this, the title, just like a one-line quote from Thomas Paine, and it didn't seem to add anything either, so I left that out. And this is the full 25 pages. The fall of Fort Ticonderoga, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Second Continental Congress, Washington takes command, the British leave Boston, and a good beginning. If you type it up, it's about 2.5 pages long. So we don't ask kids to read very much. What I came up with is this. And I hate showing you this because people, that's the thing you use to teach that. This is an example, guys. This could be a question guide. This could be a writing guide. This could be something the teacher keeps in the back of her head to guide kids to think in a particular way. I happen to do it like this because I'm a teacher and we use a lot of stuff like this. What I asked the kids to do, and I paired them up very scientifically, you and you, you and you, because it's 50 kids in a small classroom. There's no way to move. What I asked them to do was to summarize each of the stories. And of course, there are 5 stories in this chapter. There's one story about the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British Army stayed in Boston. The American forces camped around Boston, waiting for the British to move. Meanwhile, a young New Englander named Benedict Arnold had been appointed to lead 400 soldiers at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. After arriving there, he joined forces with Vermont's rough and rugged Ethan Allen. Allen led a group of rebels called the Green Mountain Boys. Before dawn on May 10, 1775, the Americans attacked Fort Ticonderoga. The British were sleeping peacefully. Allen woke up the commander by banging on his door and shouting, "Come out of there, you old rat." The Americans captured the fort without firing a shot. Inside, they found something they needed desperately: heavy iron cannons. That's the whole section. What I had the kids do, and again, they did this in pairs, I wanted them to summarize. And so first, which piece of the text were you summarizing? This is about Fort Ticonderoga. Who was it about? The kids would have to tell me about Ethan Allen and the British and the American soldiers. What happened? A little bit of a summary there. Where did this take place? Fort Ticonderoga, New York. When did it take place? The date and such are there. And why was it important? I can't tell you about every individual. I can tell you every team of kids, every partnership was able to do all of those correctly pretty easily. With one exception, the why. They weren't too sure, why it was important. That we had to work on a little bit with them. They didn't need a huge amount of guidance on that, but so like that piece I just shared with you about Fort Ticonderoga, why was that piece important? Why is the author telling you this story? Why does it matter? They got cannons, right? The Americans got cannons, absolutely. And then I had them do exactly the same thing with the next story in there, which was another battle. The Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place in Massachusetts. And it tells that whole story. But then the question becomes, what did the two stories have to do with each other? What's the connection? And the kids initially go, well, this one happened first and that one happened second. Which remember is in the standards for high school. They've got to distinguish that kind of a relationship from causal relationships. And what it turns out the connection is, and the kids have to work at this to figure it out, is they capture these cannons in New York. They lose this battle in Massachusetts because they have no cannons. And the third section is about the continental countries. This is the only one where it turned out the kids lacked some background knowledge. They didn't know what a Congress did. And if you've been watching TV recently, you might feel the same way they do. So that was the one thing we had to explain, that they would raise taxes and direct the military and stuff like that, because they just didn't know that. But there was nothing else that was giving them trouble on that. By the time the kids were done, they were coming up with the idea that what had happened here is the Americans weren't unified. Each of the colonies was fighting this war, and they couldn't win unless they unified. When they unified under George Washington, he could order the cannons from New York to Boston, and all of a sudden they could start to beat the British. I had teachers telling me they'd taught that for 4 years and hadn't understood what those 10-year-olds were explaining to them. Because he couldn't get, just like me, they didn't understand the chapter either. We looked at the textbook, the teacher's guide, it didn't tell either. The point is, what these boys and girls are doing is they're turning a series of stories that an author has told to try to make a historical point. It's an argument, and we read it like it's 4 stories or 5 stories. Now, when we got done with this, and the teachers who were using this text were really surprised how the kids did, how well. Teachers and I group up to talk about it, to go through this. And the first fellow talks is, you think social studies is just about reading text, but we like to do other things like making lye soap and things like that in social studies. And you spent in fact, I spent an entire hour on that text. I was going to give some wonderful explanation about the high level of thinking that the kids were doing and the content learning that they were mastering and all the wonderful things I thought I'd accomplished as a professor here. Before I could do that, the teacher whose classroom it was said, he did the whole week social studies, because the reason why there are 5 sections in that chapter is Monday, Tuesday. I didn't know that. You knew that right away, didn't you? I didn't know that. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I'd done a week social studies in an hour because there was so little text. She said, we have the other 4 days we can make lye soap every day. We're not doing enough of this, guys. I hope that makes the point. If you want to get kids ready for middle school and high school and hopefully for college and the workplace and the military, see, I have this one filled out for you a little bit. You've got to make sure that these kids are learning to read. We've got to build those basic literacy skills early on. We've got to develop the kids' content knowledge simultaneously. They're not at war with each other. We certainly need to expose kids to disciplinary text, and it's not enough that we do that. We actually have to guide the kids to read those kinds of texts so that they can actually make sense of them. We have to build their vocabulary to read this kind of text. We have to give them opportunities to connect the ideas across text or across the parts of text. We certainly have to include writing in these experiences. And when it's possible, when it makes sense, some of those standards I showed you that aren't for elementary, frankly, we could start addressing because it makes sense with the text that's available. I'm not suggesting that you try to change your curriculum to fit this. I'm just suggesting when it does fit, we ought to be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because it would help our boys and girls. Thank you so much for being here, folks. Thank you.